February 8, 1983. A plumbing company has been called out to 23 Canley Gardens, a respectable, leafy suburb of North London. The occupants of the flats and the property have been complaining to the landlord about blockages. Some of them, at times, have noticed a strange odor wafting into their nostrils. Something like the smell of a dead animal. Michael Compton, the guy tasked with the job of finding the cause of the blockage, opens the drain cover. Immediately, he is repulsed by the stench, but is determined. He digs his hands into the drain and pulls out the sludge. Through his disgust, he extracts what looks like flesh and small pieces of bone. Two of the house's occupants come outside to talk. One of the occupants remarks, "It looks to me like someone's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." The person who says this is Dennis Nilsen. He is seemingly an intelligent, respectable man, with the appearance of the cliched accountant. But in truth, he's a seriously deranged serial killer. A former soldier whose crimes are so appalling, so hideous. They would make any person wonder about the deformities of this thing we call human nature. Welcome to True Stories. Today, we are going to explore the case of Dennis Nilsen. A very nice neighbor to many, and a very lovable individual, but not all that glitters is gold. As always, if you enjoy, don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. Nilsen was born on November 25, 1945, in a small, rugged fishing town in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. His father was Norwegian and arrived in Scotland after the German occupation of Norway, and that's where he met Dennis's mother. As is so often the case with future killers, the vast map of childhood for young Dennis was marked with many traumas. The three children of the marriage were all conceived only when the soldier decided to visit. There was no love, just carnal instinct driven by a soldier's loneliness. Not surprisingly, the marriage didn't last long. Still, the one person that young Nilsen adored was his grandfather. This strong bond between the two would later drive Nilsen into committing the most heinous crimes. They, too, took him on walks through the sand dunes as the waves of the foreboding sea smacked the shore. He loved his grandfather dearly. Sadly, at age 62, while out fishing, his grandfather died of a heart attack. Even as a young kid, Nilsen was plagued by melancholy, often saying that without his grandfather, his life was just empty. Once his grandfather was gone for good, his constant need for someone there, someone to love who'd never leave, could have been the making of the monster to come. In his early teens, Nilsen realized he was a homosexual, but this was something he kept quiet. He felt confused and ashamed, more so because he was attracted to boys that looked similar to his own sister and brother. At one point, he touched his brother while he slept. While exploring his feelings, his brother woke up, and from then on, he belittled Dennis at every opportunity, calling him a in public. The brother even called him a hen, a Scottish term for a girl. It was excruciatingly embarrassing as well as sad. Dennis felt he had no choice but to leave that small-minded, windswept town. At 16, he did just that by moving to England to train with the army. He loved it, every minute of it, except for the fact that he had to keep his attraction to his fellow soldiers a secret. Deployed in West Germany, these mixed feelings took a toll on him, and his antidote to his agony was hitting the bottle. The habit, it would turn out, was very useful for him as a serial killer. He wanted a man, but he knew what would happen if he came out in the army. Let's not forget this was early 1960s England, a time of pervasive homophobia. Nilsen was struck with his fantasies once that consisted of a passive lover, a man completely subdued to his will. Better still, an unconscious man. He was then stationed in the Middle East, where for the first time soldiers in his regiment died. He was even kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver at one point. He almost died himself. As a result, the darkness that always enveloped him grew more intense. He'd seen death. He'd almost died, and now his fantasies were driven by death. They often included intimacy with dead soldiers. It was only a matter of time until fantasy would manifest as fact. In the early 70s, he moved to London and joined the police force. It was then that, for the first time, he started going to gay pubs and having short-term relationships with other men. He had thought the fruition of his sexuality would have been a good thing, finally able to be intimate with another man. But now, he was reminded of the loss of his grandfather again. He later became a civil servant, and eventually rose to the position of executive officer. He was affable, hard-working, a nice guy who people liked having around the office. But somewhere, during all his success, he'd started murdering the men he never wanted to leave him. On November 1975, there's a scene outside a pub, an ordinary sight in the rough streets of England. Nilsen helps a guy out, a 20-year-old, who he later discovers, after a drink or two, is gay like him. Soon, a relationship blossomed. Things were looking up. They both moved into a house on Melrose Avenue, the first place that would become a house of horrors. Like a scene from a Hollywood rom-com, the two loved-up men spent months cleaning up the place, planting flowers in the garden, painting the walls, giggling as they threw soap suds at each other. However, as time went on, that pall of darkness soon hung again over Nilsen. Just a year into the relationship, the soap suds turned into plates and glasses. They hurled abuse at each other. They slept in separate beds and brought other men home. By 1977, the two had gone their separate ways. This would be the last living love of Nilsen's life. He met men, but like others before them, they had no intention of staying with Nilsen. This was problematic for our killer. 1978 arrived. Lonely and distraught, Nilsen put all his efforts into working hard through the day and drinking heavily at night. That was when he met his first victim, a teenager trying to buy booze. Nilsen was out that night on the prowl, and as luck would have it, the boy found someone to buy him booze. After a heavy session on their acquisition, Nilsen woke up to find the sleeping bird next to him. He didn't want him to leave. He couldn't leave. In his mind, he said, "You'll stay with me over the new year, whether you like it or not." Nilsen took out a tie from a drawer and walked calmly over to the sleeping boy. He strangled him and then drowned him in a bathtub full of water. Now, the boy was his. He could do what he wanted. The body stayed under the floorboards for months, until Nilsen burned it, in that garden he once made so pretty. Just a few months later, the hard-working civil servant felt he was in need of another long-term partner. This time, he met a young man in London from Hong Kong. Again, after the victim was supplied with strong alcohol, Nilsen brought out his tie. But this time, it didn't work, and the man escaped. The victim told the cops, of course, but then decided he didn't want to take things any further. But did the cops investigate the matter? What they saw was a well-spoken man who had a disagreement with a stranger, and things had gotten out of hand. The authorities should have thought to at least watch Nilsen for a while, because soon after, he met a young Canadian who was visiting England. Nilsen offered to show him the sights, but first, of course, he offered some hard drinks. After ample shots of rum and whiskey, Nilsen was in one corner of the room, listening to music on his headphones. The Canadian, feeling rather wasted, had his back turned to him. Nilsen crept across the room and strangled the man with the headphone cord, whereafter he sat back and carried on listening to music. For the next week, during his boozy nights, he sat next to the dead body. He placed it upright in an armchair to make it seem like the body was still alive. Together, they watched TV. Nilsen laughed out loud at the comedy scenes, occasionally turning to his partner, the corpse, and remarking how funny the show was. The relationship ended when bloating and putrefaction started. The body went under the floorboards, but now Nilsen was single again, a great problem of his life. There were more victims, more housemates, more lovers, call them whatever you want. Each of them watched TV with Nilsen, listened to music, shared his bed. He bathed them and talked sweetly to them. He chatted to them while he was cooking and asked their opinion about the bad weather. But all of them would decompose and so essentially leave him. Even though Nilsen committed those obscene acts, some part of him knew it was wrong. Sometimes he'd spit at his own reflection after a murder, or sometimes he'd break down in tears. But no, this wasn't enough to stop this deranged man. The bodies he had piled up under the floorboards, let alone the foul odor in his house, meant he had to spray deodorant or whatever other odor, masking spray he could find twice a day to mask the smell of decaying flesh. One by one, he pulled them up, each of them riddled with maggots. Using the liquids of decomposition, no longer boyfriends, he wanted to have. He chopped them all into pieces and then took them out to the garden, where he burned the evidence. To hide the smell of burning flesh, he added to his grate fire tires from cars. Kids from the neighborhood came around, excited that some man had made a bonfire. In Nilsen's mind, they were dancing around a great pile of his former lovers. When the fire turned to ashes, he raked out the bone fragments and raked up the smashed bits of skull. He stopped killing for a while, but he couldn't fight back those fantasies of his. A year later, he killed again. But why did he need to do this? He would later say, after being arrested, "I can only relate to the dead image of the person I could love. The image of my dead grandfather, and that would be the model of him that is most striking in my mind." The next victim was a young Scottish man who made the mistake of not just talking to Nilsen, but agreeing to have a drinking competition with him. Nilsen could have drunk booze for Scotland in the non-existent boozing Olympics. He killed again and again and again. Even a young man whom he helped take to the hospital after seeing the guy slumped over after taking too much epilepsy medication. The guy returned from the hospital to thank Nilsen. That was the end of him after a few drinks, of course. This was his life. He'd even admitted later, saying, at times, his days consisted of end of the day, end of the drink, floorboards back, carpet replaced. Of course, he had to take a lot of sick days from work, and burning them was time-consuming. Anyway, when the bodies were still fresh, he wanted to spend as much time with them as possible. Then the shock came. Nilsen's landlord asked him to move out. He wanted to renovate the house, but there were 5 more bodies under the floorboards. He called in sick again, this time for a few days. He burned the bodies and collected $1,000 from the landlord as compensation. So now, we come to 23 Cranley Gardens, the 1930s. Semi-detached with Tudor-style exposed wood, a dream house for some, but a nightmare for Nilsen. It was also quite inconvenient for a serial killer, given it was divided into flats and didn't have a garden. But this wasn't going to stop him. Nilsen still invited young men up to his attic flat. But knowing the disposal of bodies would be hard or impossible, he stopped himself from killing, even when they were blind drunk. Then, in March 1982, one man got so drunk Nilsen couldn't awaken him. He tried numerous times, but the man was out cold. Nilsen just stared at the body like a famished dog that's been ordered to wait before eating. Then he snapped. He wrapped a tie around the man's neck and pulled it up. The sleeping man was thrust out of his slumber and attacked back, wrapping his hands around Nilsen's throat, almost killing the killer. He passed out, and Nilsen emitted a sigh of relief, only for the guy to breathe and moan. It took Nilsen 3 attempts to finish him off. When he went back to work the next day, he had to make up a story about the bruises around his neck. His colleagues weren't suspicious. Of course, Mr. Nilsen was the salt of the earth, a lovely bloke. The next victim changed everything. It was only 2 months after the last one. Nilsen met the 21-year-old in a drag cabaret bar in the famous Camden town. They drank together while the guy told him about how lost he felt after being dumped by another man. Nilsen's answer to that grief, of course, was a few drinks at his house. Sometime later, the man awoke, partly stuffed into a sleeping bag. He looked up at Nilsen, whose hands were around his neck. Only partly conscious, with the image blurring, the last thing he heard in a faint whisper was, "Stay still." The next thing he knew, he was inside a bathtub, with Nilsen holding his head under the water. Everything then went black. Nilsen, thinking he was done with him, placed him in the armchair next to him, so they could watch some television together. Nilsen's dog, Bleep, joined in the fun. It got up on the armchair and started licking the man's face. To Nilsen's surprise, he thought he noticed some vestige of life in the body. Rather than try to finish him off, Nilsen rubbed him all over and tried to shake him awake. The man did wake up, after which Nilsen told him he almost strangled himself while trying to zip up the sleeping bag. He said he placed him in the bathtub with cold water to bring him back. Nilsen, the hero, had resuscitated him and saved his life. Over the next 48 hours, the man didn't know what was going on, only ever being partly conscious. When he finally came back, Nilsen just let him leave, and he went off to the nearest hospital. Before they parted, Nilsen told him that he hoped they'd cross paths another day in the future. In the future, they would, but not quite as Nilsen imagined. On October 9, 1982, Nilsen called in sick. He killed again, and dissection needed to be done. Only this time, There weren't many places to hide the body parts. A few months later, he met 20-year-old Stephen. Together, they fooled around, drank copious amounts of booze, and listened to music. Later, Nilsen leaned beside the man and said, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." It seems he almost felt sorry for this victim, since, while he was killing him, he noticed the boy had bandages over his wrists. Now, he had 3 dissected bodies in his small flat. He decided to dump the organs and smaller bits of flesh and bone in the toilet, and flush them. But he was still stuck with some heads, arms, legs, and torsos. So he boiled to separate the flesh. Believe it or not, sometime later, he had the audacity to call the landlord and complain about blockage. Maybe he just wanted to be caught. The neighbors were also complaining, so time was running out. This phone call would lead to the most gruesome discovery. That plumber had an inkling that what he discovered was not the remnants of Kentucky Fried Chicken. When he returned to the house the next day, with his boss, they were both pretty darn sure they were looking at the remains of a human being. They were sure that one thing they found in the drain was a human eye. It's safe to say they didn't just unblock the drains and collect their cash. They reported the incident to the authorities. It was discovered by a pathologist that the flesh was human off various humans. The next day, the cops waited at the house for Nilsen to return home from work. They didn't tell him he was under investigation for murder, but said they were just interested in what looked like a health hazard. They asked if they could look inside the flat. He didn't object. It took about 3 seconds, after entering the flat, to notice the awful stench of human decomposition. That's a smell you never forget. When the cops told him they found human flesh in the drains, Nilsen pretended to be shocked, acting like someone else had put the flesh there. That lasted about 2 minutes, because he knew he was finished. When the cops asked where the rest of the bodies were, he pointed them to a wardrobe. Before they even opened it, they asked him if there was more. Nilsen replied, "It's a long story that goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything. I want to get it off my chest." In handcuffs, he was put into the back seat of a police car. One of the officers asked him if the remains belonged to 1 or 2 people. Seemingly unbothered, even glad he'd been caught, Nilsen answered, 15 or 16 since 1978. Sometime later, investigators found in his flat a skull, a severed head, a torso, arms, organs, and other body parts. During the many hours of interrogations, he told them a lot, but not everything. They asked him why he did it, at which point he said, "I'm hoping you'll tell me that." He said at another point, "I wish I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." During the trial, he tried to claim diminished responsibility, his argument being that when killing people, he thought he was doing the right thing. But then, the ones who got away came forward as witnesses, proving that Nilsen was in control all the time and knew exactly what he was doing. The young man he let go could barely speak. He was so traumatized. The jury were in a state of utter shock, as they heard about how he made the bodies his lovers, as if they were alive. They almost threw up as they listened to how he dissected the bodies. Nilsen stood in the dock looking like he didn't have a care in the world, and when he spoke about his crimes, he did so as if he'd done nothing wrong in the slightest. On November 3, 1983, he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 25 years. Nilsen had to be kept away from other prisoners, as he was attacked on a few occasions. He spent the rest of his life reading and writing, including his memoirs, which were put together from over 6,000 confessional notes. In those memoirs, he explains why he committed those crimes. One time writing, "I caused dreams which cause death. I'm writing because of dreams which cause death. This is my crime." In 2018, at the age of 72, he died of a pulmonary embolism and internal bleeding. No family members were present during the cremation. We've come to the end. As always, if you enjoyed, don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Till next time.